It was Father's Day 2005, and Robert Farquharson loaded his 3 sons into the car, setting off on what seemed like an ordinary drive home after a quick dinner at KFC. The drive began uneventfully, but by the end of the night, their car would be submerged at the bottom of a dam, and Robert would be standing alone on the shore smoking a cigarette, emotionless, as rescuers attempted to save his children. They could not. But as questions arose about the crash, the father's behavior, and what really happened on that quiet, unremarkable stretch of road, one thing became clear. Nothing about that night was as simple as it seemed. But fortunately, not everything that sinks stays buried. Welcome back to Crime A to Z, where we dive into cases from the first whispers of trouble until long after the dust has settled. Today, we'll be covering the tragic story of Jay, Tyler, and Bailey Farquharson, 3 young brothers whose lives were forever altered by the actions of someone they relied on. What unfolds in this case is both heartbreaking and unsettling, reminding us how easily trust can be shattered, not just by our fellow humans, but by those we trust the most. And before we get started, if you end up liking our in-depth coverage of this case, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. We're incredibly grateful for you. Let's go. Robert Farquharson was the youngest of 4 siblings. He grew up in the small town of Winchelsea, located an hour and a half from Melbourne in Victoria, Australia. Known for being quiet, shy, and easygoing, Robert maintained close bonds with his older sisters throughout his youth. After his sisters moved to Geelong for work, they continued to look after Robert, often bringing him along on outings and helping him adjust during his teenage years. Cindy Gambino was kind and generous. She was raised in the town of Birregurra, also located in Victoria. Her childhood was filled with outdoor adventures, including bike rides with friends and exploring the Barwon River. Cindy had a passion for music, especially ABBA, and a deep love for the ocean. She often wore the color purple, reflecting her vibrant personality. From an early age, Cindy dreamed of becoming a mother and cherished the simplicity of raising children. However, her early life was marked by tragedy when she lost her partner in a car accident. Despite this heartbreak, Cindy remained resilient, determined to build a happy family and create a life filled with love and purpose. Cindy had known Robert Farquharson since they were teenagers. Following the tragic death of her previous boyfriend in a car accident, Cindy found comfort in Robert's steady presence. Their friendship gradually blossomed into a romantic relationship by 1990. While Cindy felt a strong initial connection to Robert, who was well regarded within the local community, her fascination soon faded. Robert was a reliable figure in her life, often giving her rides home from the pub or local disco. Yet despite his constant presence, Cindy did not feel any deep emotional or romantic connection. She later described feeling as though she had settled for second best. He was reliable and practical, but lacked the passion and chemistry she craved. 6 months into their relationship, Cindy became pregnant. It marked the beginning of challenges between them. Robert was considered by many a mama's boy, having lived at home much longer than his peers. When he met Cindy, who was already living independently, he was drawn to her strength and self-sufficiency. However, the dynamic led Robert to treat Cindy more like a mother figure, expecting her to take care of him in various ways. After being together for about 6 years, Robert and Cindy decided to get married. But even on their wedding day, despite the encouragement from others who were there celebrating the occasion, Cindy had second thoughts. By then, they had 2 children, Jay and Tyler, and were later joined by a 3rd child, Bailey. From the early stages of their marriage, issues with Rob's character began to show. He appeared increasingly dissatisfied with his life, particularly with the pressures of work and the need to take on a second job. As their marriage wore on, Robert started to resent Cindy. Her independence and strong-willed personality often clashed with his need for support, leaving him feeling frustrated and overlooked. Over time, this tension built up, especially as Robert struggled with sharing responsibilities, particularly when it came to raising their children. The financial strain on Robert began to affect his behavior at home. He displayed passive-aggressive tendencies, especially towards the children. He would provoke them until they became upset, particularly targeting his oldest son, Jay, who would often end up in tears. Rob's cruel and reportedly even sadistic actions led the children to lose respect for him. He seemed to channel his own anger and dissatisfaction by projecting it onto those around him, creating a toxic environment within the family. As Robert grew more dissatisfied with his job and family life, his marriage to Cindy began to fall apart. In May of 2004, Cindy crossed paths with Stephen Moles, a local contractor and single father who was working on their property. With Cindy and Robert's relationship deteriorating, Cindy started confiding in Stephen about her unhappiness, seeking his advice. Although Stephen sympathized, he was hesitant to get involved, having just gone through a tough breakup himself. Over time, it became clear to Stephen that Cindy and Robert were heading for a separation. Robert began visiting Stephen's home frequently, looking for support. As a single father himself, Stephen tried to counsel Robert, but he quickly grew frustrated with Robert's constant complaints and lack of effort to improve his situation. After several months of this, Stephen confronted Robert, urging him to stop acting helpless and start taking responsibility for his children. He bluntly told Robert that if he wanted to be a father, he needed to start behaving like one. The dynamic between Cindy, Robert, and Stephen became increasingly strained, with Stephen unwillingly drawn into their conflict. By November 2004, Cindy had reached her breaking point and asked Robert to move out. As she began to move forward with her life, Robert tried to claim that the separation was mutual and that he was handling it well. In reality, Robert was extremely angry and began stalking Cindy, constantly checking where her car was and who she was with. Those close to Cindy would notice his car passing repeatedly, sometimes circling the block and appearing again. But Cindy was actually moving on. What started out as a friendship between her and Stephen grew into a romantic relationship, and the two of them began dating. Father's Day 2005 began just like any other ordinary day. Cindy started the morning with her and her son spending time with her own father. Later, she took the boys to Robert's house, having prepared a special photo of the three of them as a gift for him. Afterwards, Cindy returned home, busying herself with getting the boys' school things ready for the next day. As the day wore on, she began to wonder where they were, checking the time, and waiting for their return. Robert had taken his three sons, 10-year-old Jay, 7-year-old Tyler, and 2-year-old Bailey, on a typical day out. They drove in his 1989 Holden Commodore to Geelong, where the kids picked out a few small items. Jay got a cricket ball, and Tyler and Bailey each got a DVD. After stopping at KFC for dinner, they made a brief stop at Farquharson's sister's house, before beginning the drive back to their mother's house in Winchelsea. As Robert drove his children home, the car veered off the road after crossing a railway overpass just outside of Winchelsea. The car crossed into the opposite lane, onto a grassy area, and down a slope, plowing through a wire fence. It barely missed a tree before plunging into a dam. It was pitch black, and the water was cold, a bitter 10 degrees Celsius or 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Although Robert managed to free himself and swim to safety, his three sons were trapped inside the sinking vehicle. After reaching the safety of the water's edge, Farquharson flagged down two passing motorists. Instead of using the men's mobile phones to call emergency services, Farquharson insisted that they take him to Cindy Gambino's house so that he could break the news to her personally. He declined their offer to help rescue the children from the dam, telling them that it was too late and that his sons were already gone. Since Robert refused their offer to use their phones to call for help, the passersby called for help themselves. When Cindy heard a car pull up, she thought Robert and the children had finally arrived. But when she opened the door, only Robert was standing there. He stated, "I killed the kids." Confused and horrified, she demanded to know where the children were and why Robert had left them. Cindy, her partner Stephen Moles, and Stephen's son Zach rushed back to the dam. They arrived about 7:45 p.m., 30 minutes after the accident. Robert's vehicle was nowhere to be seen. Cindy, overwhelmed with panic and fear, was frantically running up and down, repeatedly asking where her children were. Emergency 000 was called.
Oh, my children are gone, my God! Oh, my God! Oh, my God!
So you're saying it's too dark to see out there?
It's too dark to see anything! Where are they?
Hello?
Oh, my baby!
Cindy? Hello?
Oh, my baby!
While Stephen and others repeatedly dived into the icy water to search for the children, Farquharson stood off to the side, smoking a cigarette and showing no emotion. Stephen would later describe him as standing like a boss overseeing a project at work. At one point, Robert had asked Stephen for a cigarette, and his response was incredulous. "What? Where are your kids? Get out of my face." Desperate to find the children, Stephen frantically searched several spots. Emergency responders arrived shortly after, beginning their recovery efforts. When Stephen saw them preparing ropes, he grabbed one, tying it around his waist, determined to dive back in. But the authorities stopped him, warning him that it was too dangerous. The first ambulance on the scene was directed to Robert, who was identified as the driver of the vehicle. The paramedics quickly learned that 3 children were still trapped in the submerged car. One of the paramedics observed Robert standing by Cindy's car, legs slightly apart, arms folded, seemingly detached from the chaos around him. The fact that he was not comforting Cindy, who was visibly distraught, struck the paramedic as strange. Meanwhile, officers from the Victoria Police Major Collision Investigation Unit arrived at the dam. With years of experience investigating road incidents, they quickly sensed that something was amiss. Typically, when a car runs off the road, the driver panics, oversteers, and loses control, leaving telltale marks on the road. Initially, the officers thought this might be the case, so they set up a lighting system to search for such marks along the road. Their search revealed no such markings, raising their suspicions. As police continued their investigation at the scene, Robert Farquharson was taken to a local hospital for a medical examination. Detectives soon joined him there, eager to hear his account as the sole witness to the incident. Expecting to find someone who was distraught, disheveled, and shaken by the ordeal, the detectives were surprised to find Robert relatively calm. Robert began telling them his account of the night's events. He claimed that he had turned on the car's heater, which triggered him to have a coughing fit. He said he eventually blacked out from coughing, causing him to lose control of the vehicle. According to his story, he realized too late that the car had crashed and was rapidly sinking into the dam. He described his efforts to save the children by diving under the water to reach them. But the detectives were suspicious of Robert's story. His appearance was not consistent with someone who had just dived into cold, murky water, particularly his not wet, well-groomed hair. Back at the scene, any lingering hopes for a rescue had long since faded. It was 12:40 a.m. and everyone knew there was no possibility of pulling the boys out of the water alive. Approximately 5 hours after the car had plunged into the dam, a police diver located the vehicle. It was found in a vertical position, nose down, stuck in the mud. The driver's side door was open, and Jay, the eldest son, was partially out of the vehicle, his upper body hanging through the door. A heartbreaking finding that deeply affected those at the scene. All 3 children had their seatbelts unbuckled, presumably in a desperate attempt to escape. The car was retrieved from the dam, water hopelessly cascading out as it surfaced. One of the first things that caught the investigators' attention was that the ignition, heater, and headlights were all turned off. This increased their suspicions about Robert's coughing fit claim. The headlights being off, especially at night, clashed with his account of driving normally before blacking out. The heater being off contradicted his story that it was the cause of his coughing fit. And turning off the ignition would have been a very strange action to perform under such instant and terrifying circumstances. Meanwhile, Cindy, suffering from severe shock, had been taken to a hospital in Winchelsea. So, the heartbreaking task of identifying the children fell to Stephen. He found Jay in a body bag on the ground and quietly said a prayer for him. As the police continued their investigation, the family faced the heartbreaking task of preparing the funeral for the 3 boys. The children were laid to rest in Winchelsea Cemetery, where Cindy had arranged for a burial plot beside her sons, intending to one day be buried next to them. However, unbeknownst to Cindy, Robert had also booked a burial plot for himself next to the children and Cindy, a disturbing move considering their estranged relationship and the questionable circumstances surrounding the children's deaths. To many, it seemed like Robert's twisted attempt to ensure that he would be reunited with Cindy in death, despite her no longer wanting him in life. Police brought Farquharson in for questioning. He continued his claim that he had experienced a severe coughing fit that caused him to black out while driving.
I'm telling the truth, I blacked out. I had a coughing fit and I blacked out.
Robert adamantly denies any intent to harm his children. Police ask him if he drove into the dam deliberately.
Did you drive off the highway deliberately into the dam?
No, I did not.
But as he's claiming that he did not, he does so while nodding his head. A body language cue that contradicts what he's actually saying. He reasserts that the accident was caused by a blackout resulting from a coughing fit.
I had a coughing fit and I blacked out. I can't remember anything. That's the honest truth.
But as he continues to do throughout the interview, he is shaking his head while he's claiming it's the honest truth, body language that indicates that it is not the honest truth. It all cast further doubt on the credibility of his claims. Law enforcement continued investigating the deaths of the Farquharson children, carefully gathering evidence from the crash site and detailed statements from key witnesses. Within a few months, they felt they had sufficient cause to arrest Robert Farquharson. They did so in December of 2005. He would remain in custody until his trial, which would take place nearly 2 years later in August of 2007. Throughout the investigation and the trial, Cindy insisted that Robert could not have deliberately harmed their children. At his trial, she testified on his behalf, describing him as a loving father and insisting that the crash was a tragic accident. She became a key witness for the defense, offering an emotional account of how Robert was a caring parent who had simply lost control of the vehicle due to his unfortunate medical event. But the prosecution presented a wealth of evidence to challenge Robert's claims. To dispute Farquharson's claim that he blacked out from coughing, the prosecution presented the testimony of a sleep medicine expert who claimed that blacking out due to coughing, known as cough syncope, was extremely rare and unlikely to have occurred in Farquharson's case. His testimony convinced the jury that Farquharson's account was implausible. Then, onto the physical evidence. One of the early analysis investigators performed was to examine the actual crime scene. They looked for any signs that the vehicle had lost control, such as skid marks or sudden overcorrections. They found no such indicators. The absence of these marks indicated to law enforcement that Robert deliberately steered the car into the dam. In fact, instead of skid marks, investigators found quite the opposite. The prosecution presented a computer-generated reenactment to demonstrate the path Robert Farquharson's vehicle took from the road to the dam. This simulation highlighted 3 distinct steering changes that occurred as the car left the road. They argue that these steering adjustments could not have occurred if Robert had been unconscious, as he claimed. The first input was to turn off the roadway. The second input was to straighten the tires and continue on a straight path. The third was a deliberate veer to the right to avoid a tree just before the car plunged into the dam. They argue that each of those changes in direction required deliberate physical actions from the driver. They explained that if Robert had truly blacked out, the car would not have exhibited these controlled movements. Instead, it likely would have drifted in a straight line or shown chaotic movement, not the precise corrections seen in the reenactment. Investigators also reenacted submerging a car in a dam. In their test, the vehicle took nearly 8 minutes to fill with water before eventually sinking, leaving plenty of time for Robert to save his children. This reenactment was a turning point in the trial, with the prosecution arguing that Robert had the opportunity to act but chose not to, reinforcing their theory that his actions were all intentional. In addition to the physical evidence, detectives also scrutinized Robert's behavior leading up to the crash, looking for clues that might explain his actions. Robert had become increasingly fixated on material possessions, particularly what he referred to as the good car that Cindy had taken, leaving him with what he saw as the inferior family car. This division of assets seemed grossly unfair to him, fueling his anger and resentment. And then there was the witness. A critical piece of the prosecution's case came from Greg King, a friend of Robert's. King claimed that a few months before the incident, he had a conversation with Robert in which Robert's simmering anger towards Cindy became evident, especially regarding the good car. As they talked, Cindy happened to pull up in that very car, intensifying Robert's anger. According to Greg, Robert hinted that he was planning to pay her back big time. When Greg pressed Robert on what he meant, Robert indicated that he would take away what mattered most to Cindy. When he asked for clarification, Robert nodded toward the fish and chip shop where Cindy was with the children, implying that he was referring to the kids. Greg was horrified. He admonished Robert, telling him to not even think such things, let alone say them aloud. He reminded Robert that those were his own flesh and blood. At the time, Greg dismissed the comment as Robert simply venting his frustrations, never imagining that he would follow through on such a horrific threat. However, Greg's account of the incident was not consistent when he reported it to the authorities, supplying them with 3 different accounts of the conversation over time. While his initial versions were less specific, his final version made Robert's intent to harm the children as revenge for Cindy ending their relationship very clear. Despite Greg's inconsistent statements to authorities, his testimony was keyed during the first trial. The defense challenged Greg's credibility, suggesting that his shifting narrative weakened the reliability of his statements. But the prosecution stressed that Greg's final account matched other evidence pointing to Robert's actions as intentional. The trial captured national attention, with public opinion deeply divided over Robert's guilt. Many found it difficult to believe that a father could commit such a horrific act, while others viewed the reenactments and Greg King's testimony as overwhelming evidence of premeditation. The emotional strain of the trial was significant, especially for Cindy Gambino, who found herself increasingly torn between her belief in Robert's innocence and the growing weight of the evidence against him. On October 2, 2007, just 2 days before Jay's 13th birthday, the jury began deliberations. They found Robert Farquharson guilty of murdering his 3 children. Cindy Gambino was devastated by the verdict. She and her mother, both overwhelmed by emotion in court, required medical assistance. Farquharson was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 33 years. News of the conviction was a surprise to many. Some legal professionals expressed shock at the guilty verdict. Melbourne barrister David Galbally stated that many barristers believed the defense had presented sufficient evidence to establish reasonable doubt. He predicted that the forensic issues raised during the trial would likely lead to a retrial. And he was right. Following the trial, Farquharson's defense team filed an appeal. In it, they raised concerns about the validity and reliability of the prosecution's evidence. They also challenged the reliability of Greg King's testimony. The court agreed. They overturned Farquharson's conviction and granted him a new trial. Robert Farquharson's second trial began on May 5, 2010. Among the defense's arguments was that the video simulation presented by the prosecution did not reflect the actual circumstances of the crash, including the terrain, road conditions, and other factors. The court agreed, and the video simulation was excluded from evidence. However, the car sinking reenactment, which demonstrated how long it would take for a similar car to be submerged, was still allowed. Having previously dismissed the notion that Robert had killed their children as an act of revenge against her, Cindy Gambino eventually came to believe that he was guilty. A key turning point for her was the testimony of witness Dawn Waite during the second trial. Dawn said that she had not come forward during the first trial because she was diagnosed with cancer. She said she figured that the prosecution had a strong case and that she would just be one of many witnesses, so they didn't meet her. But after seeing that he had been released pending a new trial, she came forward. She recounted that on the night of the incident, she happened to be driving behind Farquharson's car. She said that he was repeatedly braking, then proceeding, then braking, as if searching for a specific spot as he was looking deliberately toward the dam. She decided to pass him, concerned that he might cause an accident with his erratic driving. And when she did, she said that she could see that he was neither coughing nor incapacitated. Once she passed him, she said that she could see in her rearview mirror that he veered off the road. Convinced by that testimony, Cindy switched sides. In stark contrast to the testimony she provided for the defense in the first trial, she testified against Robert at his retrial. Robert also took the stand in his own defense. And as a sergeant from the Victoria Police Department observed, he dug himself a hole that he couldn't get out of. He was unable to give reasonable answers to the questions posed to him, and his answer to anything that would incriminate him was, "I can't remember." As the police sergeant noted, the jury got to see the same Robert that they saw at the hospital the night of the crash, the one whose behavior led them to the conclusion that he had killed his kids. Between Robert's abysmal performance on the stand, Cindy's withdrawal of support for him, the witness testimonies, and the reintroduction of the sinking car test, the jury once again found Robert guilty of murdering his 3 children. He was sentenced again to life with a minimum of 33 years. In the years following the tragedy, Stephen and Cindy got married and would go on to have 2 sons of their own. But their lives were never the same. Their irreversible pain was heartbreakingly evident in the powerful victim impact statement Stephen prepared for Robert's sentencing. It read in part, September the 4th, 2005. I spent some time in freezing water looking for Cindy and Robert's 3 boys. Since that night, I have not dived into water again, something I used to enjoy so much. To this day, and probably forever, I will never forget the 3 little faces that I saw that night. Every time I picture them, I break into tears, and I wonder if I will do that for the rest of my life. I find myself crying with both anger and resentment. Resentment at Robert, as well as myself. Because, although I did not do this heinous act, I felt and still do feel that I let both Cindy and her boys down that night because I was not able to find them. Unlike Robert, though, I did at least try. I now drink consistently, am on painkillers and calmatives, and am an absolute shell of the person I was. I no longer have a concreting company, rather I am now a full-time carer. I no longer laugh as a regular thing, rather I am grumpy, tired, worn out, and focused only on the everyday running of our family and home. As Cindy basically does not function anymore, I am the full-time cook and carer of just about everything. Cindy and I rarely laugh together. In fact, intimacy. What's that? I continually have headaches and neck aches. I find I don't look after myself anymore. I shower less frequent, brush my teeth less frequent. We rarely go out. I miss both the person that I was and the true happy-go-lucky, fun-loving woman that I met in Cindy. Both, I am not sure that either of us will ever be or see again. After the horrific loss of her sons, Cindy became a tireless advocate for justice. As Stephen outlined, her life was never the same after the deaths of her children. She was later interviewed and tearfully reflected regarding Robert. I hate him with a passion. I don't wish death on him because I want him to suffer. I hate what he's done to me. On May 10, 2022, at the age of 50, Cindy Gambino passed away after suffering a medical episode. There was no indication of foul play in her passing, and her death has been reported as natural, stemming from a medical condition. In a statement, Cindy's family remembered her as a warrior for justice who fought relentlessly after the devastating loss of her sons. In January 2024, nearly 20 years after Robert Farquharson's conviction, the Victorian government stripped him of control over his son's gravesites at Winchelsea Cemetery. The change came because of new legislation passed in 2021, which allows the state to revoke burial rights from convicted murderers and serious criminals. Farquharson's name, previously engraved on the headstone as the father of much loved and cherished children, was removed. It was the first time the new law was applied. The Department of Health also ensured that Farquharson would not be buried in a neighboring plot, which had been a concern of Cindy's before she passed away. Robert Farquharson was sent to serve his sentence at the HM Prison Barwon in Lara, Victoria, Australia. Updates on his day-to-day prison life are limited. Since his incarceration at Barwon, Robert has reportedly lived in the protection unit, which houses high-profile and vulnerable inmates. While in prison, Robert claimed to have experienced another episode of cough syncope 4 years into his sentence. He said he began coughing again, and, as witnessed by another inmate, collapsed and woke up after a few seconds with a fractured ankle from the collapse. His legal team argued that this subsequent episode further demonstrated the authenticity of his cough-induced blackouts. After his second conviction, Robert Farquharson launched subsequent appeals in 2012 and 2013. Both were unsuccessful. Despite the failure of his previous appeals, Farquharson has caught a stroke of luck. Recent legislative changes now allow previously resolved cases to be reopened if new and compelling evidence surfaces, giving his case renewed momentum. As a result, scientific and legal experts, as well as investigative journalists, are raising concerns about whether flawed evidence or junk science influenced the original trials. Specifically being called into question are the Victoria Police's car sinking reenactment, which was used during both trials as it showed a car slowly sinking over the course of 8 minutes, presumably affording Robert plenty of time to save his children. However, a forensic expert who specializes in vehicle submersion scenarios recently criticized the reconstruction as flawed, pointing out that it was performed in 2.8 meters of water, significantly more shallow than the dam's actual depth of 7.4 meters. He explained that in deeper water, the car would have sunk almost immediately, and most certainly within a few seconds, once a door was opened. It would have left little chance for escape, let alone rescuing his children. He concluded that the video was misleading and did not reflect real conditions. Experts also reviewed the original crash simulation video, with one expert calling it Looney Tunes for not accurately reflecting real conditions. That simulation, which was shown during the first trial, depicted a completely flat terrain with no obstacles, no slope, no fence that Robert plowed through. So experts recently created their own accurate 3D simulation, which included those missing elements. With that accurate simulation, the steering shifts that the prosecution argued Robert must have made deliberately were actually consistent with how the car would have naturally responded to each terrain change and obstacle that he encountered. According to the experts, the only intentional steering action needed would have been for Robert to veer off of the road, something they argue could have happened accidentally during a coughing fit. Farquharson's cough syncope claim is also being revisited. A highly regarded respiratory specialist has pointed out that Farquharson, who had a chest infection at the time of the accident, fits the typical profile of a person prone to cough syncope, namely being a middle-aged male, overweight, and with a history of smoking. In his professional opinion, it was around 90% probable that Farquharson did indeed experience a cough syncope episode on the night of the crash. Farquharson's claim got an unexpected boost when, in October 2015, truck driver Jeffrey Ferguson blacked out from a cough syncope episode while driving, causing a fatal crash. In Ferguson's case, he actually had corroboration. He happened to be on the phone with his brother during the incident, providing confirmation of the blackout. Ferguson was initially convicted and sentenced to 8 years in prison, but he served only 2 years before appealing and winning his case. Notably, the same medical expert who testified against Farquharson, claiming that cough syncope was rare, also testified against Ferguson. Farquharson's defense is now using Ferguson's case to support his upcoming appeal. And then there were those witnesses. Both Greg King's inconsistent accounts of his conversation with Robert and Dawn Waite's testimony at the second trial came under intense scrutiny. When investigative journalists probed deeper into Dawn's account of the evening, she revealed an inaccuracy that had been missed during the trial. She admitted that she had a receipt showing that she was at a restaurant 30 minutes away from the crash at the time the crash occurred. If accurate, that would have made it impossible for her to have witnessed the events just prior to the crash, as she claimed. Dawn's credibility coming under question was particularly troubling because her account was considered uncontested by the Court of Appeal and also played a significant role in shaping the outcome of the case. Her testimony was what convinced Cindy of Robert's guilt, leading her to switch sides and testify against him. Police had also used Dawn's statements to support their analysis of the crash path. In light of the new evidence, the Australian Academy of Science has taken the rare step of calling for a judicial review of Farquharson's case. They argue that the justice system failed to apply proper scientific standards to the evidence presented at trial, potentially leading to a miscarriage of justice. Farquharson's lawyer and supporters hope that this fresh evidence will lay the groundwork for a new appeal, and with it, a chance at exoneration. Currently, Robert Farquharson remains in prison, where he has served nearly 2 decades. Barring any successful appeal, he will be eligible for parole in the year 2043. Farquharson's case leaves more questions than answers, with some convinced he's innocent, others certain of his guilt, and many people unsure but focused on proper evidence analysis and standards in the judicial system. What are your thoughts? Do you think Robert set out to murder his children, or was it a tragic accident? Has any of the new evidence swayed your opinion? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you like how we presented this case, please help us by taking a quick moment to hit like, share, and of course, subscribe.